The names of the first recorded mercenaries in history might have been UG-ni-ʼsa, Warad-Sîn, or Namram-ʼsar. But if you look up any publicly accessible book about mercenaries, you'll find other examples mentioned, like Nu.Banda Mardune, an Amorite captain in the service of Sargon of Akkad, or the Sherden Sea Pirates. What both these examples have in common is that they might have been soldiers who voluntarily fought for profit. That's the definition of mercenaries provided by most dictionaries. But the expert joining us today has a different take.
Yeah, right, exactly. This is the trouble, is a lot of people just assume, oh, mercenary, everybody knows what that is. And it's something roughly like, oh, foreigners serving for pay. And
this is Stephen Morillo, an expert on defining different types of military service. We thank him for agreeing to an interview with us. With his help, we're going to explain who actually qualifies as a mercenary and who doesn't. Then we're going to dig deep into the archaeological records and search for the true beginning of what is often labeled the second oldest profession in history.
Can't tell you how long. I'm not gonna. If I knew, I certainly wouldn't want to signal that to Saddam Hussein.
In a press conference held by the White House in late August of 1990, then President George H.W. Bush found himself in a bit of a pickle. After asking other nations to help bear some of the costs associated with the Gulf War, he was forced to explain why American troops in Saudi Arabia were not, in fact, mercenaries. Quote, "Burden sharing can be accomplished without making forces mercenaries. US forces should never appear to be mercenary forces," Bush explained. Don't get us wrong here, we're not implying that American soldiers are or were mercenaries. But this example illustrates that the standard definition, soldiers voluntarily fighting for profit, is neither very precise nor analytically practical.
The trouble is that is a definition that includes way too much and can be somewhat misleading. Soldiers in the current United States Army are paid to fight. I mean, they earn pay. It's a job. It's not just a job, it's an adventure.
So being an American soldier is a job. Being a mercenary of an American private military contractor like Blackwater is also a job. Both earn money, both fight voluntarily. For example, Blackwater was hired by the US government to fight alongside the regular troops in the Gulf War. So payment and the voluntary nature of the service are not enough to define mercenaries. A third element people often bring up is foreignness, meaning that mercenaries typically come from another country.
So pay is not enough. And foreign, the trouble with foreign is that it's fairly time and culture specific. Foreigners fighting for pay is a very sloppy way to define mercenary service that turns out not to makes the wrong distinctions and then doesn't make enough distinctions, because there are plenty of soldiers who fought for pay, who have been, even foreign ones, who are not mercenaries.
For example, a Gaul fighting in Caesar's army was a foreigner but not a mercenary. He was a Federate or part of an allied contingent. Moreover, the US company Blackwater often employs Americans, who then fight for the US government. So they are mercenaries but not foreign. All this is to say that the definition provided by many dictionaries do not allow us to distinguish between private military contractors, other forms of mercenaries, and regular American soldiers. To find out who the first mercenaries of history were, we must properly understand what a mercenary is. In a paper Stephen Morillo published in 2008, he defines mercenaries and other forms of military service along two axes.
My solution was to come up with a typology based on a graph with two axes. First axis, in terms of defining terms of service, is that they could range from political terms of service to economic terms of service. You know, why does the soldier serve this particular master?
A conscript of the Second World War, for example, makes for an extreme case and would be placed in the upper left corner. In this scenario, the state basically forces conscripts to grab a weapon and go to war. the soldier has little to no choice. Think of soldiers in the Vietnam War. Many of them didn't want to be there. At the other end, we have somebody who has a choice. He could be a farmer, a carpenter, or a soldier, but he chooses to be a soldier because that is the best economic decision at the time. Is it just about motivation, then? Political motivation versus economic motivation?
You want to be careful there, because as an historian, if your question is, what was this soldier's motivation? That's often a question that is utterly unanswerable. You simply do not know. So this is why I focus especially on terms of service, that you often can know from written agreements and things like that. And contracts is a good sort of rough analogy for the sorts of ways that soldiers are hired. What shaped your contract? You can answer that much more easily than what motivated the soldier.
So what we're really looking for is terms of service that are economically driven. Think of a salary that you put in a contract, for example, as opposed to a volunteer who fights because he supports a cause ideologically.
The other factor is that soldiers, people making those choices, will be in their terms of service more or less embedded in the society that hires them as a soldier. In other words, at one end, the most embedded, you're serving volunteers in an army, in a national army. You serve because you believe in the state, you believe in its cause, you might get paid, but that's not why you're serving. You're serving because, you feel a duty.
For a volunteer, think of a Greek citizen soldier fighting in a phalanx to defend his city. He's highly embedded. He doesn't go to war because of money, but because he has a stake in the system. A modern US soldier, on the other hand, would be placed here, much closer to the center. This is because, strictly speaking, a US soldier, although still deeply embedded in American society, is a professional. It's a job. You don't have to do it. You could also just be a carpenter. So he's not just a citizen soldier defending his country. Okay, so strictly speaking, we can identify mercenaries not by their motivation, but by their relationship to their employer, their terms of service. This relationship is economically incentivized. Additionally, mercenaries are unembedded. So now you may be asking yourself, isn't unembeddedness just the same as foreignness? No, a Blackwater mercenary is not a foreigner, but still a mercenary. So what does unembeddedness mean then?
Sure, that's a great example. That someone serving for Blackwater, which is, I'm going to classify as mercenary service, because it's a job for pay, and they might be Americans in their civic life. They might even be voters in a particular state. They probably are. But in terms of the terms of service they agree to as part of Blackwater, that Americanness has no bearing. They're joining, in effect, an international corporation. And don't get me started on multinational corporations as the ultimate mercenaries, because they've got no political allegiances whatsoever except to profit. So they're like purely mercenary organizations. But Blackwater being a military corporation is a very good example of economic terms of service. You're hired for a job, and the fact that you're American has no bearing, because they will hire from all over the world.
So unembedded also refers to the terms of service, the contract, if you will, not the nationality or ethnic background of the mercenary. So taking the two axes of Mr. Morillo's typology together, in terms of their relationship to their employer, mercenaries are unembedded and economically driven. So far, so good. But where would we put the alleged earliest mercenaries? A Sherden Sea Pirate from the 13th century BC, for example. Was he a mercenary?
They're not. Those are totally not mercenaries. Who hired them? What's the terms of service? There's no terms of service. These are migrant raiders and settlers.
On the graph, they could be placed either as a bodyguard similar to the Praetorian Guard or as some sort of embedded ally. It depends on the time and particular situation.
So you go from embedded to unembedded, and you go from political to economic. And that's not binary choices. That's both of those are continua, so that you can be halfway along the scale in either direction. So you end up with a scattergram sort of types of service that are a mixture of different levels of political and economic involvement.
The Sherden arrived in Egypt as part of the Sea Peoples, a major migration at the end of the Bronze Age. They likely came from Sardinia, but that is not clear. The historian Geoffrey Emanuel explains that once they arrived in Egypt, they lost a battle and were taken into captivity by the Egyptians, removing the choice of employer as an important criterion for mercenary service right from the beginning. Moreover, the Great Harris Papyrus records that the Sherden were taxed by the pharaoh and forced to settle in certain areas of Canaan and Middle Egypt. They served as bodyguards for the pharaoh at times, as reported in an inscription about the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BC. That makes them more like the Roman Praetorian Guard, a force intended to protect the pharaoh from both internal and external threats. While they were probably chosen for this task because they were not highly embedded in Egyptian society and therefore had less of a stake in internal politics, that doesn't mean they were mercenaries. A similar example are the Varangians, who were Norsemen in Byzantine service. They were chosen as the emperor's bodyguards because they would loyally protect him, even from attacks from within. So, the evidence suggests that the Sherden were a regular, albeit foreign group who was connected to, but not really part of Egyptian society. They were not a group of mercenaries who wandered around working for the highest bidder. In addition, the Sherden had limited options when it came to employers. They only really worked for one empire. The same is true for the 24th century BC captain Nu.Banda Mardune in Sargon of Akkad's army. Also, he might have been paid, but it's not clear how. Was he paid in land or the right to land, like later medieval fief holders?
The trouble is, that's not a strictly economic reward. Because if you have a piece of land, why is the land valuable? Because it has peasants working on it. You've just been put in a social political situation. Mercenary, small individuals or groups of mercenaries who are serving for anything other than money as a reward gets complicated because those will have social and political implications.
So, to find a true mercenary, we need some sort of money system and some sort of proto-market economy to allow mercenaries to choose between different employers. Nu.Banda Mardune's only employer was the Akkadian Empire.
A market economy where you've got one seller and one buyer is not a market economy. It's a fucking monopoly. We got plenty of those. If you want to get, I will start on monopolies. But yeah, monopolies kill market economies. And if Egypt is the only potential employer, is not much of a market economy.
However, like Nu.Banda Mardune, many soldiers that were usually considered mercenaries have preferred partners. For example, the Swiss often worked for the French, Blackwater works for the United States, and the PMC Wagner Group has close ties to the Russian government.
Right, so this is economic choice, but constrained by some political arrangements. So they might fit in that bottom quadrant, but they're much more up to the top, heading towards types of soldiers that you would consider as subsidized allies or federates or things like that.
However, this usually holds only true if the market situation is satisfactory for a mercenary group. If not, they look for other partners or even turn against their employer, as seen with the Russian Wagner Group, who marched on Moscow in 2023 because they didn't get what they wanted. So even if they have ties to certain governments, mercenaries often do not work for one employer but offer their service to the highest bidder without much ideological constraint. So, in our search for the first mercenaries in history, what evidence should we look for?
Yes, that's a fabulous question. What you've got to look for is broad evidence about how the economy worked. And that becomes sometimes hard to get at. And you've got to bear in mind that what might look like a market economy might be true. You might have in some places, a market in pottery, because pots are useful. People buy them, or in small farm implements, and there's not a lot of metal around, so you make some metal implements. People will buy them from you, and there are traveling merchants. There's a network of merchant activity all over the world from fairly early on, but the things they buy and sell are fairly limited. Small items of utilitarian use, and that's not enough of an economic system to support mercenary service. You've really got to have a broadly based market economy, and those don't happen much.
Okay, without further ado, let's look at the oldest archaeological evidence that points us to the first mercenaries in history. On the edge of the Syrian desert, a spectacular archaeological discovery of about 1,100 old Babylonian clay tablets changed our understanding of the first mercenaries of history. These tablets, collectively known as the Tel Leilan Archive, feature letters and administrative documents of the city of Shubat-Enlil, and frequently mention a group referred to as Habatum. The Habatum are often labeled the first professional mercenaries in history. The Habatum fit some of our requirements for mercenaries. For example, they were known to have changed sides in a conflict between the two city-states of Habur and Shubat-Enlil. In addition, an old Babylonian administrative tablet that was accidentally discovered on the surface of Tel Kalat al-Hadi, southeast of Tel Leilan, records the division of nearly 30 kilos of silver into 3,500 pieces as payment to the same number of Habatum. So we have evidence of the Habatum acting as paid hands and being paid in some form of currency. This led Jesper Eidem, professor of ancient Near Eastern history, to argue that, quote, "There can be little doubt that they, the Habatum, must be regarded as professional mercenaries ready to offer their services to any king or state with enough silver to pay them," end quote. Even more striking is that the Habatum are a relatively new phenomenon. We can state this with a high level of confidence because in 25,000 slightly older tablets found at Mari, the Habatum are not mentioned at all, while many similar raiders or allied troops are mentioned by name. So they probably didn't exist before. However, we must ask, were the Habatum merely raiders that were bought off to leave or redirected into enemy territory? That would make them comparable to the Vikings, who appeared much later.
Take these bags of gold and go away. That's not a contract. That's not an employment. That's blackmail. That's not an employment situation. It becomes a sort of subsidized ally with the power relationship reversed. Normally the state, the political entity, is in control of things and can decide to hire a group or not as subsidized allies. But if the subsidized allies can force the state to pay up, again, that's not mercenary service. That's blackmail. You're paying them to go the fuck away, that's not establishing a permanent relationship, contractual relationship. And I suspect, therefore, that many of the sort of mercenaries of the really ancient world were simply raiders who were bought off that way and said, "Please go away, here, we'll give you money."
So they could simply have been brigands, raiders, outlaws, or opportunists. This also fits with the explanation provided by Jack M. Sasson, a prominent Assyriologist. Quote, "Rather than referring to mercenaries, the term Habatum suggests renegades forming their own bands." End quote. To confuse matters even more, the noun Habatum stems from a root that can mean to move cross-country, hire out, and rob, steal, so the word can cover a wide spectrum of meanings. What's more, some Habatum also appear to have had other, much more ordinary jobs aside from plundering or fighting, so we can't be sure that they were mercenaries. To find definitive proof of mercenary activity, we need evidence that the same individual or group was fighting for different rulers did so because of monetary interests and was recorded doing so in more than one instance. The Yale Babylonian collection is in the possession of two Babylonian lists of soldiers. Both list an almost identical number of men and both date to the same time, the early Old Babylonian period. One of them refers to the men on the list as Habiru or Apiru. The term Habiru appears in hundreds of documents dated back to the 2nd millennium BC, spanning a 600-year period from the 18th to the 12th centuries BC. These documents have been discovered at various sites across Egypt, Canaan, Syria, and Anatolia. The Habiru are often considered the early Hebrews because of the similarities between the two names, but this does not seem to be a resolved debate. It is likely that Habiru was a negative label applied both to a social class and individuals. Linguistically, the term seems to stem from a word meaning dust or desert, leading many historians to assume that the Habiru were desert raiders or nomads. At any rate, they likely lived on the fringes of settled societies. Primary sources often describe them as outlaws, refugees, or robbers. So, what can we make of the two Old Babylonian lists? They mention the same names, 61 and 62 names respectively, and list the soldiers in almost identical order. However, there are noticeable differences between the two tablets, including variances in shape, size, format, and spelling, as well as different formulae in the concluding sentences, and various ways of writing numerals. These differences led Mark E. Cohen, Professor Emeritus of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University, to argue that these two tablets are from two different places. Also interesting is the fact that according to their date stamp, one tablet was created 11 months later than the other. One is dated to the 9th month of the year, the other to the 8th month of the year, with no indication as to the year. We also know that some of the soldiers were promoted or demoted in the time between the creation of the two lists. For example, an individual designated as UG-ni-ʼsa is described as a regular soldier in one tablet, while on the other he is Nu.Banda, a leader maybe similar to a captain. Another man, Melki-Eliel, has a lower military title in one tablet and is later promoted to Ugla. In total, there are 6 or 7 officers out of 55 men, with the highest being a general. According to the Assyriologist Mark E. Cohen, quote, "It seems unlikely that any regular military establishment would create an army unit headed by a general with just 62 men. That so small a group of men would have so many officers suggests that the structure was formed from within the group, not imposed from without, as a part of a regular army organization." End quote. These men with the names UG-ni-ʼsa, Warad-Sîn, or Namram-ʼsar were recorded in 2 different places and had a clear military hierarchy. They were Apiru, outsiders, meaning they were not part of a city's standard army, and they were recorded working for different employers. This suggests that this band of Habiru traveled around, offered their services to various cities, and in that process were registered and put on the payroll of these cities, hence the 2 lists. Mark E. Cohen concludes, quote, "Although meaning émigré or refugee or the like for Habiru is clearly warranted in some archives, based on our 2 texts and the very high preponderance of texts in which the term Habiru occurs in a military context, the term Habiru in some periods and in some locations assuredly denoted professional mercenaries." End quote. In the 18th century BC, this would have made a lot of sense. The quickly shifting political alignments at the end of the 3rd and the beginning of the 2nd millennium likely resulted in many migrations and violent displacements. This would have created the perfect breeding ground for a mercenary market because there were numerous employers and many uprooted people looking for a way to make a living. In situations like these, becoming a mercenary was a sensible solution, because a group of mercenaries also offered protection and could reliably defend itself against other raiders and robbers. So Jesper Eidem was probably right when he wrote, quote, "It may be supposed that this phenomenon, large groups of mercenaries offering their services to the highest bidding king, is a new factor in the socio-political landscape of Mesopotamia, since similar specialized groups are not attested in the slightly earlier texts from Mari." End quote. So, if we trust the interpretations of Assyriologists regarding these 2 clay tablets, as well as their assumptions regarding a market economy with silver used as a currency in the Old Babylonian period, could this group of Habiru potentially be the first mercenaries in recorded history?
Yes, I think they could. And you've got conditions there where, I don't know how deeply and richly the market economy pervades that society, but it's certainly enough of a market economy for at least luxury goods to be traded. And mercenaries might be considered luxury goods by some states. And the key there is, in that old Babylonian period, like Greece in the 3rd, 4th centuries BC, there's lots of independent states, little city states. And that potentially could establish the sort of market conditions where this is also early enough that nobody's armies are particularly sophisticated. It's before much in the way of cavalry or even chariots. When you introduce chariots, suddenly you've got a whole different military equation. Therefore, a group who are actually experienced fighters with a certain amount of cohesion because they're a group that has fought together would be a valuable commodity in those interstate wars. And it is certainly conceivable. Again, not a huge amount of evidence, 2 clay tablets, that's a lot to build a vast structure on. But those are conditions where it's conceivable.
So UG-ni-ʼsa, Warad-Sîn, or Namram-ʼsar might be the first mercenaries in recorded history. However, this is not a definitive answer. We must consider the possibility that we applied the criteria incorrectly, or that there might be earlier examples that we missed. Bronze Age primary sources are hard to find, and even harder to read. So if you do know of some older examples, please let us know in the comments down below. We're more than happy to correct our errors, which is something that I was recently reminded of when working my way through a visual guide on the philosophy of Stoicism, called The Obstacle is the Way. The visual guide teaches a framework how to overcome obstacles and turn them into opportunities. It's available on the app Imprint, the sponsor of this video. Imprint is basically my antidote to doom scrolling. Rather than mindlessly scrolling through the internet and wasting my time, I prefer to learn new concepts and ideas. Imprint's lessons are very bite-sized, some just about 2 minutes long, which is ideal when I have some time to kill, for example when riding the bus or train. With Imprint, I can still scroll on my phone and relax, but also consume meaningful content. Imprint offers a great variety of courses and lessons, from the essentials of philosophy to the science of happiness, to history, economics, and psychology. What makes it engaging for me are the animations and the interactivity. This helps keeping my attention. Besides being the alternative to doom scrolling, it's a big plus for me that I can easily learn the key concepts of some of the most widely read books and learn the core ideas quickly. As somebody who tends to engage in a lot of discussions with all sorts of people, this gives me a lot of new ideas to talk about. Imprint makes consuming ideas quickly easier because it's based on the science of learning, meaning each chapter is broken down and explained visually. At the end of each chapter, you must answer a question, which really helps you remember the concepts. I suggest you try it out yourself and replace doom scrolling with learning. For all fans of our channel, Imprint is offering a 7-day free trial and a 20% discount on an annual subscription if you use the link in the pinned comment or description below.